Korean pop culture or Korean media products became popular, became internationally known first in some part of East Asia since the late 1990s, mostly in Chinese-speaking regions such as mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and some other Southeast Asian countries where there are many ethnic Chinese are living. It was a kind of regional culture of the East Asia since the late 1990s until the late 2000 or so. So the very history of the international popularity or the popularity overseas of Korean pop culture is like almost like 25 years or more, a quarter century, kind of longer than some people might expect. Especially if you are not really familiar with the very popularity of these Korean pop culture, usually called as Hallyu in East Asia since the late 1990s. It seems that it is too sudden, and why is it happening at this moment? But it's kind of it has been an international culture since the late 1990s. But one thing I can see here, I can see these days, especially since the early 2010 or mid 2010, is that enjoying Korean pop culture, especially for non-East Asian, such as like Americans, Europeans, or Latin American people, or like people living in Central Asia or like South Asia, it seems that for them, it is a kind of the latest trend that they can found in the cyberspace. So it means that Korean pop culture, the popularity of Korean pop culture is closely related to the very change of the media environment that the mainstream media such as like TV or other, mostly TV and some other like radio or something is now losing their dominance over the media industry, but other media formats such as, for example, YouTube or Netflix has been bigger and even more powerful since the early and mid 2010. And these Korean pop culture media products is one of the very beneficiary of this the very big change happening in the media industry, as well as they are not only the beneficiary, but they are also very helpful for those media industry to become big in global media environment. So what I mean is that there's a kind of interdependent relationship between these new media format in the in the cyberspace and the Korean media products.
I completely get your point about the development, that it was at first regional and now it's spread to so many parts of the world in doing that. Why, I guess, so a question that often comes to me though is why Korea? Why K-pop? Why did aespa and Blackpink and these things come from Korea and not Japan or Argentina or Brazil? But it was there, and we know Korea has had a turbulent 20th century history. So how is it that Korea has been able to do that?
I have been asked these kinds of questions, especially comparing to the very popularity of Japanese culture or even the Chinese culture, because Japanese culture was very popular, was very so big until the late 1990s in East Asian region, and some of Japanese culture, such as anime or manga, has also really popular even outside East Asia, right? Many of my like American students, for example, have been a big fan of those like Japanese animations or the manga or other things. But it is also related to the very attitude, which means that Japanese culture industry did not really try to promote. I don't exactly know this word is great, but they did not really try to promote their culture or sell their culture in East Asian region, but only focused on those like Western countries such as United States or European countries for global success, which was not really successful because the very strategy that they chose did not really work well. That they tried to erase as much as possible. Those Japanese cultural aspect or something that looks like very Japan in their music or in their films or others. But K-pop, although firstly it was not really for the international audience. it was actually the local music, mostly aiming at the domestic audience of Korea. But when
Right.
it was found, I should say it was found by or discovered by chance by East Asian audience, then suddenly people in East Asia, when it was found and discovered by East Asia and became a very popular music in East Asia, Korean music industry found the very possibility that their music could work, their music could be successful and could be accepted by the international audience, which had not been believed by them, I mean, until the late 1990 or early 2000. So they try to make, what I mean by they is the industry and the industry insiders, such as producers, composers, or businessmen, try to make more international or global kinds of music and product by inviting international composers or producers to work with other like Korean producers and composers, I mean, kind of collaborations. And also they try to catch up the very latest trend of the global pop music, especially the global electronic dance music, to make more like trendy music and more latest music that can draw attention from the global audience, which is also very different from, let's say, Japanese market or Chinese market, that although of course they are also thinking about all those global trends, but the very first thing they try to do is to be successful in their domestic market, which means that their domestic market is really big.
Yep.
So they do not really have to do all those like hard effort, and they do not have to overcome all those challenges to penetrate into the international market. It's a high risk but low return for them. But Korean music industry and Korean culture industry, their cultural market is not that small, but they try to find a new market that they can get some more like profit, or they get some more popularity. So they have been actively looking for those new market or international market, and have been producing some products that can satisfy all those like the international audience.
Is that search? It's really good points. Is that search in Korea for the external markets, which is perhaps unlike maybe Japan and China as much? And I remember in the mid-90s, and I was in a grammar school in the south of England watching things like Ninja Scroll and Akira, not knowing quite what they were, but they were there on, pirated videos. Is Korea's search for external markets, is that demographic driven? Is it because they simply don't have the population here that you see in China or Japan? Or is there elements of nationalism and legitimacy seeking in that? Or is it economic? Is it ideological? Is it both? Neither?
I don't think it is closely related to the nationalism or nationalistic ideology. Maybe Korean government tried to promote that it is based on the patriotism, or it is kind of for the national interest, but the actual businessmen or other industry insiders, first of all, like, the East Asian financial crisis happening in the late 1990s was a big, threat to Korean culture industry. Actually, many like music, for example, in the case of music industry, many record labels went bankruptcy between the 1998 and 1999, and some like big chaebols, the large corporations such as Samsung, LG, or SK, who did begin their cultural industry business in the mid 1990s, suddenly withdrew all of their business from the culture industry because they had to like do certain reconstruction because of the financial crisis that they met. So some new music labels and the culture industry could not help but trying to find new market because of all this economic difficulty that they had in the late 1990s. So they, at the time, they thought that like China, which opened their door to the world at that time. China closed their door to the world even until the early and mid 1990s, but because of their like change, especially in their economic system from like communism to capitalism, could be the very opportunity for Korean culture industry to enter into. So I think it is kind of the very coincidence that Korean culture industry, who were looking for a new market, and those Chinese and some other East Asian countries who are looking for some new products, but it should be cheap. Maybe American music, American culture, or Japanese culture and Japanese music might be better than Korean one, but it was kind of expensive for those like East Asian local industry to accept. But for Korean culture is a cheaper but relatively a kind of the like decent quality that East Asian audience could enjoy. So that was actually the very beginning of like the internationalization of Korean culture industry, mostly by chance, which is very interesting.
Yeah, you always need chance and opportunity in these things. You just mentioned sort of China's opening up and things like that. Another thing is that South Korea has been relatively closed in terms of the ability for South Korean people to travel abroad. That was restricted quite heavily until rather recently. Japanese cultural products were restricted inside South Korea. One of the radio stations that I work on, they still don't kind of allow you to play Japanese language songs on there. That's still kind of today. Do you have any thoughts on about sort of South Korea's closure of cultural products from outside and how that's opened up, Dr. Q?
The Korean government did not really want to officially open their cultural door to Japan, maybe based on the historical like conflict between like Korea and Japan. And I also had a very kind of, should I say it, episode when I was in like high school. There was a kind of high school broadcast 교내 방송 at the time, and when I was in high school, and one of our high school DJ, of course he was my colleague, played Japanese popular music, which was not really allowed at the time during the lunchtime. So he got some like punishment from the teachers and the school because it was illegal, to play all those Japanese music officially and in public. The official ban on pouring Japanese cultural products was ended in early 2000. And at the time, in early and mid 2000, many Japanese musicians could actually release their CDs or DVDs, and also Japanese films, Japanese TV series were officially introduced by Korean cable TV networks and others, which were really popular. But the Japanese pop culture, which had a big impact on the construction of Korean like popular music, Korean and TV series until the late 1990, was not that popular than expected when it was even officially introduced to Korean audience in the early 2000 and the mid 2000. Maybe it is related to the very shift happening in Korean culture industry. Maybe it is based on the growth of Korean culture industry, or maybe it is based on a bit too late for Japanese culture industry to enter into the Korean culture industry. In the past, there was a belief that Japanese pop culture might be like better and more developed than Korean pop culture, which might be also the reason why Korean government did not really want to import Japanese pop culture openly. There was a kind of fear shared by Korean government and some Korean people that if Korean culture was like dominated by Japanese culture, there might be the Japanese colonialism, kind of cultural colonialism again happening in South Korea, which should not happen. It's just the very attitude towards Japanese culture is different from the attitude towards, let's say, like American culture or British culture or etc. So yes, it's a very special case, I think.
It is, yeah, and we sometimes need that historical understanding, and certain memories are still real for people. Just going, and we'll talk perhaps a little bit later about one of the recent articles that you wrote on the Japanese influence on K-pop, but just going back to this export idea, what I've noticed, and I'd like to get your take on this, Dr. Q, is that in my Korean Wave or Hallyu university classes, I've always noticed that a lot of the Korean university students are generally not big K-pop fans. They're either listening to Doja Cat or Selena Gomez, or they were perhaps K-pop fans in middle school, high school, but now they're kind of not as much into it. Whereas many of my international students, they're very passionate about K-pop and they're still into it. And I notice sometimes that, well, from my experience, it seems that the K-pop is very popular among international students, but not as much in the domestic population. Have you noticed any of that? Do you have a different take on it? What's your view?
I think it is very interesting that in Korea, just like you mentioned, K-pop is considered as music mostly for teenager, and when they become when they are into their 20 and become a university student or college student, they tend to think that it is not their culture. I mean, it is a kind of culture for the younger one, the teenagers, not for them. So actually, some of them still are enjoying K-pop and still a big fan of K-pop, but they even try to hide that they are still enjoying K-pop, because there is a kind of the common sense still shared by many Korean university students, especially, that it is, should I say, childish or something. Like, it is not for your age to enjoy all those idols or K-pop musicians, because they are, I mean, they are too young, or like it is not good music for all those 20 or college students to enjoy. But for international fans, they do not have these kinds of stereotypes about those, like about enjoying K-pop or being a fan of K-pop. And even these days, it is a kind of very new trend for them, which means that if you know more K-pop musicians than, let's say, BTS or Blackpink, which is very famous and everybody knows, but if you know some other musicians from Korea who are not that popular but still making great music, such as like Din, or how about like other musicians like from the hip hop scenes or something, and you will be considered as people of fashion or people of latest trend that is very ahead of like the latest trend compared to other who only knows BTS or Blackpink. So it is becoming kind of new culture for them. So if you can show that you are very familiar with K-pop or Korean culture, and you do know many of them instead of only famous one, then it can be your pride or something. So there is a very different culture shared by international student. I mean, international college student and the domestic Korean student. It may be related to the very stereotypes or prejudice that they have about K-pop, while international college students do not have. It is related to the very culture of like K-pop, especially those idol bands. In 1990 or the early 2000, even for the middle school or high school students, some students who tried to be different from others, they did not really want to be a fan of like these early K-pop musicians, because it was at the time, even it was considered as the kind of childish or too commercial. So if you know much about popular music, then you should be a fan of, like, let's say, British rock band or American hip hop musician rather than the K-pop musicians. So there is a very different image of K-pop musicians shared among domestic fans and the international fans.
Which is really interesting to think about, because then it's not the actual music itself, but it's rather the cultural perception, the stigmas, or the like hipster bonus points that you can get depending on your culture. So it can be cool in one culture and not as cool in another. Do you think then, when you mention about sort of beyond K-pop, and I guess in this sense we're using K-pop as to be that sort of idol music rather than everything popular, do you think that K-pop success may come to the detriment of other genres in Korean music? Of course, because there's a whole host of, they're doing glitch hop, they're doing trap, they're doing all sorts of music in Korea, but we now kind of associate sometimes Korean music with K-pop. Does the success of K-pop, does it go to the detriment of other genres?
Yes, I think that especially these days, many international fans who firstly has become a fan of K-pop music is now looking for other genres from Korean popular music rather than K-pop. So just like I mentioned that you look more cool or you look more hip if you know Korean popular music musician rather than the famous K-pop musicians such as like Dean, Cold, or Hyuk-oh Band, or some others, Saeso년. So actually, they are from indie, and many Korean younger audience, like college students, for example, enjoy all those indie musicians rather than the mainstream K-pop musicians. Yes, I believe that actually it is happening, that K-pop is a kind of the very way for international audience to get to know other Korean pop music musician and other genres. Kind of gateway, I think.
Because yeah, as you say, there's a lot of good music out there. I like Hyoko's stuff. They do really good stuff, and it's different, it's unique, it's weird. You, Dr. Q, you play the bass, right? So I can see even on your picture here,
true.
right?
Yeah,
So
yes.
you're a musician, and I've seen some videos of you play. You know, you rhythm and things like that. You like Prince. Does that make you look at K-pop differently? So whether, because for example, I have a musical background as well, and sometimes when I'm looking at K-pop, the music that's being produced, I sometimes come at it from not a fan's perspective, not an academic's perspective, but just from a musician's perspective. And sometimes I think, you know, the really interesting songs and not the songs that are getting 100 million views and vice versa. Does having a musical background make you look at K-pop a little bit differently at all, or can you separate them?
Actually, musically, you know, K-pop is mostly based on electronic dance music, hip hop, and R&B. But the these days, K-pop musicians are trying to do some other stuff. That they try to do some collaboration with the indie bands. We mentioned about Hyogo, but still, also Hyogo also had some collaboration work with the mainstream K-pop musicians as well, and like Giant T or others are also trying to do something with the K-pop musicians. And even among the K-pop musicians, although they firstly made their debut as an idol, but after the end of their regular contract, usually called as the 7-year contract, then they try to become other kinds of like, although they are still in the very field of K-pop, but what they are trying to do is something different from the typical K-pop music, but rather like the more authentic hip hop or kind of a rock sound or something like that, rather than the K-pop music. I'm not saying that K-pop is musically not really good. Actually, it is really great because many K-pop producers or composers are trying to catch up the very latest trend of the global pop music scene. So when we listen to K-pop, we can easily find that the very latest trend of the global popular music has been already reflected in today's K-pop music. Even even sometimes even sometimes seems like I don't exactly use the word avant-garde. I can use the word style in K-pop music, even from the SM or even from the YG, one of the two of the major K-pop agencies. But still, what they are doing is not really typical commercial music, but sometimes it is very experimental. So I think it is very interesting. One thing I would like to add is that although musically K-pop is still great, but K-pop should not be enjoyed only by like focusing on music or only by listening to music, because music itself is very important in K-pop, but the other culture related to K-pop, such as, for example, music videos, or how about their performances, their like external images or fashions, and the way how they keep in touch with their fans, and how they make the relationship with their fans, is also the important aspects of K-pop, also the very important parts of K-pop. So when we think about K-pop, or when we try to discuss K-pop, we should consider all the things together as a way of enjoying K-pop, not only focusing on music. So when I enjoy K-pop, of course, I am listening to their music, but I try to see some other things related to the music, or even the non-musical aspects as well.
I was speaking to Jae Chong from Solid the other day, and he mentioned that while perhaps American or Western music is going a little bit more, maybe not avant-garde, but towards sort of bedroom and sort of lo-fi sounds. And there was less money in the industry there in the production levels. You're correct that K-pop still seems to have really high quality level in terms of music, but not just the music, but the videos and the aesthetics. Everything is really, really polished. You briefly mentioned the fans there, Dr. Q. So this is such a huge and complex topic. It could be a topic all on itself in terms of K-pop. A lot of the sort of undergrad students that I work with when they're doing their research or things, they're drawn to this nature of the relationship between the fans and the idols. And there's a lot of talk about sort of the parasocial nature. You have fan labor, you have social media activism, you have messaging apps and fan service. What's your view on K-pop fans, the role they play, and the relationship between fans and idols and entertainment companies?
Of course, the role of the active audience, the role of active fans has been really important in global music industry. But K-pop may be more significant because the reason that K-pop could be introduced to the international audience outside East Asia is actually based on their word of mouth. Is it a great word of mouth? Like in the internet space, because when it became the music for the East Asian audience, it was not really known to international audience outside East Asia, but still there were many ethnic East Asian from like Chinese immigrants, from Vietnamese immigrants, from other Filipino immigrants living in very different parts of the world, of course in the United States, but also in different parts of the European countries, France, Britain, or some other parts, Germany. They based on the their like connection, although they are British, they are French, they are German people, but still they do not like cut off the very relationship with their own home country and their culture when they construct their identity, which means that some certain music which is popular in their own home country can draw attention from all those like descendants of the East Asian immigrants living in different parts of the world. So they actually played a very important role to introduce K-pop music to their friends who are not non-East Asian background, but also came to love with the K-pop, like based on the being introduced by their, like, for example, Chinese American fans or Chinese British fans. So the role of the fans have been really important, and these days it's becoming even more important because they are now more actively supporting their musicians, not only by purchasing their CDs or going to concert or buying some other like merchandise, but try to create certain strategy to raise them, to breed them from the very earlier period when they are not really known to the larger audience till they become really successful. I mean, when we see the very case of BTS, for example, when they made their debut, they were not really popular in their own domestic market in Korea, but a small number of their loyal fans continuously supported them to make them a big star, and actually they did it. So fans actually believe that it was them who made these like non-popular musician to become a global big musician. So they expect their musician and their agency to care more about their like intention and their will, because they made them stars. So agencies and musicians, you should listen to what we are saying and what we are asking you to do. So the relationship between fans, musicians, and agencies are becoming more equal. Just like kind of the tripod between these three different agencies, compared to the relationship of fans, labels, and musicians in other genres. So it is very unique culture that K-pop only have, that fans can do more things and they can show more voice, and they can show more influence even on the agency, the labels, and the musicians.
I like the tripod idea in that, what you say, Dr. Q, and you raise a lot of good points, because now the gatekeeping is not done so much by big labels or industries, but the fans have the ability to boost the reputation, the image of these artists through their sort of streaming dedication. You can go online and see all the rules for streaming, and they set targets, don't they? You know, we're going to have this many views by that. So do you see this increased power of the fans? Is it a good sign? Is it democratic? It's now kind of bottom up, and the consumers or the people can make choices. They have a more active role, and then they can sort of speak to the companies and demand that certain values or ideas be adhered to. Or perhaps the other way, is it sort of, you could take a Marxist perspective and say that these companies are forcing these sort of young, less rich people to do all the work, but not getting any of the financial benefits from it. Do you see it as positive, negative, somewhere in between?
It was very positive, and it is still positive, and it seems a more kind of democratic movement that fans is making something. Although record labels or musicians might also did a very great thing, but it was actually fans that they have made all those cultures related to K-pop, such as, for example, they do something when the music video of a particular K-pop musician was released. There, of course, there was no English subtitle. It was only sung in Korean, but many international fans did add English subtitle, Spanish subtitle, or subtitle of other language without being paid, right? It was their voluntarily act based on their, should I say, I do not really like this word, but their true love. Interestingly, of course, now industry knows that. So these kinds of democratic like movement or participatory culture is now observed. Now it's becoming a part of culture, the music industry, that they try to make these kinds of participatory or even very revolutionary culture as a part of their capitalist system. We have seen all these cases in the very history of popular music. When I believe that you also know that when punk became a big thing in 1970, it was a kind of very revolutionary culture, but soon it was observed by the industry, and now it is becoming a kind of major rock genre rather than very revolutionary thing, right? How about hip-hop? So it is, hip-hop is also very revolutionary, but now it's one of the most commercial genre that many like big companies are related, and big money businesses. Hip-hop is becoming a big money business. And I think K-pop is also on the very similar way. It was based on these fan participatory or active fan culture, which is very democratic and even revolutionary in some point, but it's now was eaten up by like the capitalism.
Yeah, it's a good way of describing it. And you mentioned there punk, you mentioned there hip hop. Now, when those came through, they were both revolutionary in terms of the music that they were doing, because they were different from what had gone, whether it was technologically or in terms of attitude, but they also had political undertones to them, or not even undertones, but explicit political messages. K-pop has largely been apolitical. Certainly, you know, there have been elements of it, whether you look at sort of Sotaji's early stuff about talking about children running away from home and so on, but I've heard you speak on the apolitical nature of K-pop before. What I would like to ask you, Dr. Q, is that can it remain apolitical, or with the increase of fans, with the increase of their role in the K-pop success, especially international fans, and they have different values and ideas from, say, domestic Korean students, what happens to the political nature of K-pop going forward if we put all these factors together?
Oh yeah, this is very interesting point. And because just like you mentioned, and actually K-pop was not that very political. It is apolitical because the lyrics, for example, was mostly talking about the typical love story between men and women. Although some of musicians talked about, for example, H.O.T. or Suttage and the Boys, or even BTS talked about the life of the teenagers, and they try to criticize, so they try to deliver some social message regarding these, like the pressures and some like unfairness of the society. But generally, it was a kind of safe music, safer compared to the, let's say, hip hop, which has been actively delivering social messages with their lyrics. But these days, as you can see, there is very interesting things that happening related to K-pop music. That while K-pop musicians do not really actively show certain political stance or social criticism, fans are using K-pop music and their musicians when they try to make their own social criticism or trying to deliver their own political message. So, for example, Twice song did not have any political message in their lyrics, but it was used by supporters of the Democratic Party of the United States and the supporters of the Joe Biden, who is the president today, when he won over Donald Trump on the election. So the song was actually used in some YouTube videos or some other like memes, but as to mock Trump and as to celebrate the win of Joe Biden, regardless of the lyrics or regardless of the image of the Twice, who did not have any relationship with the political message. So this is very interesting thing I can see is that K-pop itself, from like non-English speaking region and non-Western country, is essentially kind of the culture for minority. Because when, for example, when international people listen to K-pop music, they do not think it is very mainstream music, because first of all, it is not sung in English, and it is not from any developed, I mean in any Western country. The East Asian ethnic that Korean people, K-pop musicians have, and the language that they are using makes them in a very special status as a culture of minority, or culture of, I mean, the alternative culture against the mainstream, not because of their revolutionary musical style, not because of their lyrics dealing with certain political message, but only because of their, I mean, natural characteristics. So I think this is very interesting. Although K-pop itself may not be political, but still it can be political, and it should be political, especially by the younger generation of the international audience, who find some other meanings from K-pop and its culture, which was not intended by the musicians and the labels themselves. And these days, it's very interesting that now K-pop, of course, K-pop labels and musicians know this very meaning of K-pop among international audience. So those musicians are now trying to go with their fans, which means that when some musicians try to make their voice actively regarding the environment issue, or the other like racism issue or gender discrimination issue, which was not really allowed for K-pop musicians to show, but now it is necessary for them to like show their opinion about these matters, because fans want them to do that, and fans are expecting to do that. And as I told you, that there's a kind of closer relationship between fans and the musician and the labels, which makes musicians and labels cannot help but listening to what their fans want their musician and labels to do, and they should do, or those things that fans want them to do, such as like making more like active voice about the political issue, or the like climate change issue, or the gender issue, etc.
Do you think that those international fans. So it's not just, so you've said that they can interpret K-pop and they bring it into their own identity and the issues that they're dealing with, but more than just subjective interpretation, do you think that these international values, such as, let's say, perhaps cultural appropriation or the use of blackface, the use of certain hairstyles, queer baiting, gender fluidity, these are much bigger issues in other parts of the world than in South Korea right now? And so I wonder if these entertainment companies, they might be seeing that they're international issues and start adhering to them, whether they're doing it for economic benefits, for the fans' demands. But does this then start reshaping or affecting Korean domestic culture and domestic attitudes in some way? Or is it always just interpretation?
I think it is also related to the K-pop musicians themselves, because in the past there was a more strict management and strict control over their musicians from their agency. Yeah. But these days, the relationship between musicians and agencies is getting, compared to the past, getting more equal. Although it is not perfectly equal, still there is an unequal relationship between agencies and the musicians. But compared to the past, what I mean, it is getting more equal, and the control and management over those musicians is getting weaker, which means the musicians themselves now can show their own opinions and their own identity more openly than before. And actually, those musicians, K-pop, young musicians in K-pop industry is also one of the younger generation. I mean, simply speaking, they are also the part of Generation Z. Yeah, which means that those musicians also have interest in those issues. Not only because of the economic factor, not only because fans want them to say, but they themselves actually have interest in all those issues as a part of the global younger generations. Because of this, the change happening in Korean music industry, now musicians are also can say and should say what they want to say. And it makes a kind of shift happening in Korean music industry as well, because for example, when some influential musicians are making and make a statement about the gender issue or the political issue, I mean the social issue, it can make a debate among audience and even audience from Korean domestic market, which can be a very good opportunity for Korean younger generation and society to think about the issue that they may not have thought about before. So yes, they although not everyone K-pop musicians is doing these kinds of thing, but there are more and more K-pop musicians trying to do what they want musically or socially, which is making a shift in Korean culture industry.
Yeah, and I think that's part of Korean culture itself changing, with more individualism, as well as sort of fans' demand from the international perspective. They want more authenticity from their artists, perhaps more, want to see more of them. I'd like to ask you, if I can, just one last question about K-pop, and perhaps then we'll jump onto dramas. And of course, there are many groups we could talk about, whether it's Cypher or ATEEZ, Stray Kids, but I'd like to ask you a question about BTS and their success, if I can. And I remember that originally a lot of the reasons that we were asked to pay attention to BTS and their great success, which should be applauded and is fantastic, was that they produce their own songs and they address social issues. You touched on that a little bit already. Recently, we've seen them smash the billboards, crush it. They've done fantastically. They win at the AMAs. But they did that with sort of 3 English songs written by, whether it's Dave Stewart, Ed Sheeran, and things like that. My question here, I guess, is that they achieved this great success by removing a lot of those Korean things from it. So does this just sort of show the hegemonic strength of the Western system, that to get to the top of these charts, you have to have it in English, you have to be doing this kind of international style? Is it possible to achieve success and remain Korean? How do you view this, Dr. Q?
it is true. You're right. Then they have made a bigger success with English lyrics, such as like Dynamite or Butter. But if they release these English singles previously, then the Korean ones, I don't think that they could make success just like they are making right now, which means that they can make a big hit song such as Dynamite and Butter based on the popularity that they have made since the 2014 till 2018 or 19, like 4 or 5 years. Still, if you want to be a big K-pop musician, even internationally, you should show your own like K-popness or Koreanness. It can be the Korean lyrics, or it can be your like Korean ethnic, or it can be the other factor. But if you just try to make some very global and universal kind of music, it might not be able to draw attention from the K-pop fans who want something different from the typical global pop music. Many of them listen to K-pop because it is different. It is not exactly the same with the global pop music, such as like, for example, from Justin Bieber or Ariana Grande, who are very great musicians, but only the American pop music musician. But BTS and other like Blackpink and others, they are different in terms of their racial character, in terms of their language, of course, in terms of their musical style. So still they have to differentiate from all those global pop musicians, and their Koreanness, whether it can be the language, it can be the music, or it can be the other factor, still matter much more than expected. So of course, English song can be helpful when they try to appeal to the larger audience, just like BTS have done. But before doing all those like strategy to appeal to the larger audience, first of all, you should be a like globally known star, right? And these Koreanness can make you a big star. But if you only depend upon those like strategy of like orderless culture, or like erasing your cultural characteristics and make it into more general kind of like such as English song, it might not be really helpful still, I think.
I completely get where you're coming from, because so many people, they look at K-pop for what it does differently, for the uniqueness, for that thing that they can't get anywhere else. It's a really great point. And of course, congratulations to any groups that do achieve that success, because it's so hard to do. I'd like to turn to dramas, if I could, Dr. Q, briefly, because what's going on with Korean dramas at the moment, and with Netflix specifically? This is what's interesting me. It's a very big topic, but over the last few days, Hellbound has been in all the papers, from The Guardian to the Wall Street Journal to New York Times, and saying that it's, the Netflix #1 drama. From what I understood, it was only there for one day before it then dropped off. And which makes me kind of question, is it a media push to get these things popular, with the dramas now I'm talking about? But what's your take on Korean dramas and Netflix at the moment? How are you looking at this sudden phenomenon?
Actually, compared to the popular music, I'm not a great expert of the dramas, but still I have been researching about Hallyu things, so only I can say it's kind of the general point. As I told you, as I mentioned during our discussion today, the dependence of like Korean media products on these new kinds of media format, mostly based on internet, such as Netflix or YouTube, has been really great. And people who are watching Korean TV series, the group of people who are, international audience who are watching Korean TV series, it's not really different from the group of people who are enjoying K-pop or other Korean media products, such as Korean variety shows. It means that when they come to have interest more in Korean media products, whether it was began by K-pop or it was began by Korean variety show, still they come to have more interest in other parts of Korean media products. And TV series have been popular, especially in East Asian region, since the late 1990s. And actually, the first Korean cultural product that became internationally successful was those TV series rather than the popular music when it became the regional culture in East Asia. So there are still big fans of Korean TV dramas in East Asia and some parts of Asia as well. And thanks to the popularity of K-pop and the popularity of other Korean media products, now K-drama is also attracting the global audience who are enjoying their culture mostly via internet media format rather than the traditional media such as like TV or cable network, etc.
I saw you in one of your interviews, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said that if people wanted to watch a Korean drama, they should watch Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha, Gebmal Cha-Cha-Cha, rather than Squid Game.
I talked about it when I had an interview with our university university representative.
Right. I was doing my research, Dr. Q, and but I agree with you that Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha does seem more Korean, but I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that aspect of it.
Squid Game is based on the kind of dark reality of Korean society or materialism. The main theme is not really very Korean. I mean, it is Korean, but still it is very universal. That if you do not know much about Korean society or Korean culture, still you can enjoy Squid Game without knowing any like context of Korean political economy or Korean history or Korean culture. Because the theme itself is very universal. You should survive to win over others, and even you should kill them to get like a lot of money as your prize.
Yeah.
The very basic, simple thing. But
it's like a computer
Hometown
game.
Cha-Cha-Cha is a bit very Korean style, I think, even from the very background and the way how main characters are doing is still based on very Korean culture or very, should I say, cliche of Korean TV dramas and Korean TV films. So if you know more about Korean, if you have watched Korean TV series before, or if you have watched Korean films before, then there will be less cultural discount. But if you do not know anything about Korean culture, but Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha, if it is the very first one that you think, what is it? Why they are doing like this, or why they are saying like that, and why the director of TV series are describing these characters like this or like that, you may come to wonder. So
yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a lot more that you could learn from or learn about Korea watching that one than Squid Game, but it seems a lot of the analysis has been on that. From these dramas, whether it's been sort of Hellbound or Itaewon Class or Sweet Home, a lot of them are coming from webtoons. Now, I'm not sure whether you read webtoons or not, but for me growing up, Dr. Q, comics were either kind of for young kids or they were for nerds. That's just the culture that I grew up in at the time. They weren't widespread across society or culture. But in Korea, it seems to me that webtoons are different. You see, on the subway, you'll see young people reading them, old people, businessmen, students. They seem more popular in Korea. And it seems that a lot of the recent content is being derived from, it's being influenced by, whether directly or indirectly, these webtoons. So I just wondered if you had any insights or any thoughts on what webtoons are in a Korean context, because they're not comics as I know them. So first of all, I guess, what are webtoons, do you think, in this Korean culture?
Yes, I perfectly agree with you that even in Korea, like comic books were mostly for kids or the teenagers, and when you became older, then you might not want to read all those comic books. But webtoon may be different because, just like you mentioned, I was actually about to say that everyone is reading webtoon mostly in their like very short free time, not just the free time, but when they have some time, but not that long, that they will read those webtoons with their smartphone mostly. And interestingly, there was a kind of, I do not exactly know whether other countries do have these kinds of culture, but in Korea, when they are in subway go to their work or go to their school, and until the late 1990 or the 2000, many people actually read newspapers,
Mm-hmm.
news articles, and many of them were actually many of them were free, that they could get any like free newspaper in the subway station. Of
Yeah.
course, it was they were sponsored by many different companies, and in those like newspaper, there were always a kinds of cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
And those cartoons were not for the teenagers or younger generation, because uh, it was for the like the people who use subway for go their work or their school. So
Mm-hmm.
those cartoons were for the older generation in those newspaper read in the subway. But now everybody is having their smartphone. Nobody is reading the paper-based newspaper, right?
Mm.
And the webtoon has been replacing the very status of the cartoons, which was in those newspapers in the past. So it was a kind of culture that they try to read something, or they want to read something,
Mm.
they want to watch something, and webtoon and the YouTube videos are two things that they can watch and they can read in mostly in the very public transportation. So the webtoon is not closely related to the comic book culture, but more related to the cartoons and the newspapers, mostly read by the adults and the older generation. So maybe the kind of the culture that existed since the 1980s or 1990s till present.
I've never connected webtoons to subways and newspapers before. That's a really interesting thing to think about. But yeah, and sometimes these things are just opportunity, their luck, and how they develop. I guess perhaps just a final then question for you, Dr. Q. Where in terms of this Hallyu, we've sort of started by covering a lot of culture and then music, then dramas. Where are you looking next in terms of the study of Hallyu, whether it's your own research or just general interests? What do you think is a fertile field or something interesting for you to be looking at in Hallyu study?
One thing I am looking at is I have interest in is that when K-pop or Korean TV series, Korean dramas, and some other Korean cultural products are going more and more global and internationalized, there are more and more like non-Korean entering into the very field. For example, how about the Netflix is not a Korean company, but they are investing a lot of money to produce Korean series, which become popular globally. And how about the K-pop scene? That's like some big record label, the entertainment agencies are making the local band in the United States or in European countries. Although what they will do is the very similar kinds of music and style of K-pop, but if there is no Korean but only American, only Britain, or only French, then there is a kind of conflict in identity of what is Korean culture. If there is no Korean members in the kind of local K-pop band, or if the TV series or film are made only by the foreign financial or international funds rather than the Korean company, can it be called as Korean culture, or can we call it as also a part of Hallyu? Because Hallyu is a kind of popularization of Korean media products and Korean culture, simply speaking. But if those cultures are not Korean, but only starring Korean actors or Korean musicians or some Korean people, and even without Korean musicians or Korean actor, can we call it as a Hallyu, or can we call it as a Korean culture? Then what is the very meaning of like being Korean or being Korean culture, or even Hallyu, if it is not perfectly Korean thing? What I have interest in these days is this kinds of like identity changing, or maybe identity. I should not say, if I may not have to say that it is a kind of identity crisis, but still there is a shift going on. the very meaning of like being Korean or being Korean culture. And I want to see what will happen next in like music or TV series or film if more and more non-Korean like finance or non-Korean culture aspects are entering into them.
As long as there's Korean ethnicity, as long as there's Korean people in there, that's sort of making it, whether it's a K-drama or K-pop. But yeah, it's strange to focus on that. How about this idea then, Dr. Q, that currently this is happening because Hallyu, Korean culture, popular culture, is so successful that big, large companies like Netflix and entertainment companies are investing in it. But perhaps in the future, there'll be a new trend, just like there was Hong Kong movies and then J-pop, and there might eventually become a new big thing that comes up. And then at that stage, when the global system looks elsewhere, then it will return to the, I don't know if this is a romantic or a nonsense idea, but then it will return to being sort of that more authentic Korean culture that's being produced and made by Koreans for Koreans. Do you see that happening, or is that a bit off the mark?
I think it is possible because global audience like Korean culture because it is different from the other like global culture that have been dominant from United States, from Britain, or from some other like Western countries. So it is still very necessary, although it is like international, being internationalized more and more, but still there should be something Korean or something Koreanness which make it different from culture from other countries. So some more authentic or some more like ethnic Korean like cultural aspect should exist, should be found in like K-pop, K-dramas, or K-films, although there should be some universal aspect that can appeal to the larger audience. So it may be the very job for Korean culture industry to make a balance between this like being global, being universal, and being Korean, or making more Korean cultural aspects.